Hello everyone and welcome back to Deck Tech Tuesday. In this series I showcase a random deck and try to explain the inner workings of said build. For this week we're going back to Standard and are taking a look at a new brew of mine, Colossus Control. Due to card prices being unavailable in MTGO, a majority of the deck and its card prices are not going to be up to date. This includes the fact that most of the Aether Revolt cards in this list are at a higher price point due to the set only being out for such a short amount of time. If this list looks interesting to you, I'd suggest picking up the non-Aether Revolt cards first, and then buying the rest of the builds once the cards are at a much more affordable price. So, what is Colossus Control? Well, normally a Metalwork Colossus deck focuses on getting out the namesake card as fast as possible, and then you try to pummel your opponent with a 10-10. The issue with these types of decks is that there's usually only one path to victory, that being the Colossus itself, which is why it's somewhat considered to be a combo deck. With this build, however, I decided to shift the focus from being not just a Colossus deck, but also as a control shell that focuses on artifacts. Our first card in the list is a 3 of Metalwork Colossus. Now, while an 11 mana 10-10 is kinda garbage, we can cheat it out by having a decent amount of non-artifact creatures on the board to help reduce its casting costs. This is a key proponent for our deck, or else we wouldn't really be playing that many artifact spells in the first place. For the most part, having a 10-10 can win the game for us, considering that we can always get it back out with the graveyard from its second ability. But since we're not entirely dependent on this strategy to win our games for us, we only run 3 copies as opposed to 4. So, what are these artifacts that we'll be using to help cast our Colossus? We'll first take a look at our 4 of Prophetic Prism. For 2 mana, we get a do-nothing artifact that helps us draw a card. And that's what we need to understand what's going on with this deck before we get any further. Yeah, Prophetic Prism can fix our mana for us in certain situations where we need it, but for the most part, this card doesn't really do anything. That is, until you look into some of the deeper synergies that we have going on in this deck. The same is true for our next card, which is a 4 of Metal Spinner's Puzzle Knot. For the most part, this card serves pretty much the exact same purpose in our deck as Prophetic Prism does. That being drawing us a card and to provide us an artifact for us to use later in the game. Now, while it does have another ability where it can sacrifice itself to have us draw another card, I can't really suggest actually doing that. Again, this is another type of spell where we really don't want it to do anything besides just sit on the board because of the inherent synergies that it has with the rest of the deck. Moving on to the next card, we have a 2 of Hedron Archive. For 4 mana, we get a 2 mana rock that can not only help us cast our Colossus at a much faster rate, but it can sacrifice itself to draw us cards. Now, yes, while the second ability is akin to that of Metal Spinner's Puzzle Knot, Hedron Archive has the added benefit of being able to produce mana for us. But, seeing as how it's considerably harder to cast than the Puzzle Knot would be, I can't really suggest playing more than 2 of this card in the main board. And for our final artifact spells, we take a look at a pair of Cogworker's Puzzle Knot. For 2 mana, we get another do-nothing artifact and a 1/1 artifact body. While the 1/1 won't be able to help us cast the Colossus, it does provide an early blocker to help us stabilize in the early game. And if we're desperate enough, we can crack the Puzzle Knot to get another body on the board for us. Coming across white mana shouldn't be too hard considering that we have both playsets of Prophetic Prism and Spire of Industry. Moving on to the creatures in the deck, we begin with a playset of Glint Nest Crane. Now, let's be honest here. A 2 mana 1/3 flyer, it isn't really that good. I know, but just hear me out. Having a 3 toughness body is actually pretty relevant in this format. It can block a decent amount of aggressive creatures early enough in the game to where we can start to get the ball rolling for our deck. Not only that, but when it enters the battlefield, we can use its ability to find an artifact for us, or at the very best, it can grab a Metalwork Colossus for us. As far as the last creature in our build is concerned, we begin to look at the other strategies and synergies that I had mentioned before. And with that, we take a look at our 2 of Herald of Anguish. Now, I genuinely believe that this is one of the more underrated cards of Aether Revolt. Being a 7 mana 5/5 flyer is kinda trash, but it has a unique ability, that being Improvise. This is where the artifacts laying around on the board begin to work with the rest of the deck. Improvise is essentially to artifacts as to what Convoke is to creatures, meaning we can tap untapped artifacts to help cast a spell that has the Improvise ability. Beyond being a potential 5/5 flyer for just 2 black mana, it has 2 other really sweet abilities. The first is that we get to rip a card out of our opponent's hand each turn. In the late game, this card exceeds expectation considering that most opponents won't usually have that many cards in their hand, theoretically. If we can get into a situation where our opponents are top decking because of something like Herald of Anguish, then we've already excelled at what previous Colossus decks were trying to do. Not only that, but we can use its last ability to throw away artifacts to kill off any threats that might end the game in our opponent's favor. Moving on to the next set of win cons in the deck, let's move to our playset of Uncle Tezzeret's Bad Touch. So, Uncle Tezzeret is super creepy, and this enchantment here exemplifies that. For 3 mana, we can turn any dead artifact on our board into a 5/5 beater that can help us close out a game really quickly. Not only that, but if the said artifact is put into the graveyard, we can get it back thanks to the Bad Touch. So at the very worst, we can potentially use this on a cantrip artifact and use the touch as removal bait and have another draw outlet in the process. So this begs the question, do we play Uncle Tezzeret? Why, of course! Just not the expensive one. Instead, we're playing a 1 of Tezzeret Master of Metal. To be honest, I really do actually like this card better than Tezzeret the Schemer. Mainly because Master of Metal plays so much better in this deck than Schemer does. The reason why is because not only do we get card selection off of Uncle Tez's +1 to help us find a Colossus, but its minus ability can help us win the game in situations where we wouldn't be able to hit our opponents with a creature. Now, while it can't protect itself as opposed to Tezzeret the Schemer, Master of Metal can utilize our artifact sub-theme much more consistently. So what exactly makes this a control list? Well, aside from our sideboard's access of tools to fight the meta, we have a somewhat decent set of spells to help keep the path clear for our beefy beaters. We'll first begin by going over a pair of Fatal Push. Push can kill mostly every early threat that our opponents can throw our way, but the best part about it is if we can sacrifice an artifact beforehand, or we're able to find a way to remove something from our side of the board, we can use Fatal Push to kill something with converted mana cost 4 or less. While it can't handle stuff like Ishkanah or Avacyn, it can take care of pretty much almost every other relevant creature threat in Standard. For our next removal spell, we have a 2 of Grasp of Darkness. What makes both Grasp and Fatal Push very playable in this format is the fact that they are instant speed spells. Vehicles are definitely a concern in this format, and while the Looter Scooter isn't around anymore, we still need to worry about relevant threats like Heart of Kiran. This is where a spell like Grasp of Darkness comes in. Not only can it take care of crude vehicles, but the fact that it affects the state of a creature means that we can use this card to play around other things like indestructibility or pump effects. And for our last removal spell, we have a playset of Battle at the Bridge. Again, having the option to affect the state of a creature by giving it -X/-X makes a card like this much more playable over something like Ruinous Path, for example. In addition, we also gain life according to what we have paid into the spell, which helps us stabilize against much more aggressive strategies. Not only that, but this card also has Improvise, meaning that we can have the X amount be at an absurdly high amount to take care of any significantly large threats. Or, on the other hand, we could just dump as much mana as possible into killing just a tiny creature, just so we can net a decent amount of life in return. And for our final spell on the main board, we have a 3 of Yahenni's Expertise. Now, while this isn't something like Languish, it's definitely better than something like Flame Tendrils or Drown in Sorrow. Giving -3/-3 to all creatures is pretty relevant in this format, considering all of the small synergistic creatures that are currently running rampant. Its second ability, however, is where things begin to take an interesting turn. Once we cast the Expertise, we can cast an Uncle Tez's Bad Touch, a Prism, Puzzle Knot, or whatever costs 3 or less for free. That's good. Really good. Like, oh my god, Becky, kind of good in a deck like this. Considering that we're actively trying to cheat out stuff anyways, a card like this not only adheres to that kind of plan, but it also helps to keep us alive. Moving on to our non-basics, we start off with Spire of Industry. Spire will more than likely always be able to tap for a colored mana, given that we have a 1-4 shot of always getting an artifact card. But the fact that it can just tap for colorless mana without the loss of life is just plain upside. It's better than what Glimmervoid could do in a deck like this. Then again, if Glimmervoid was legal, I really don't think we'd be wanting to play a Colossus deck in the first place. We're also playing a 1 of 2 different types of tutor effect lands. Both Inventor's Fair and Sanctum of Ugin have one purpose in the deck: find Metalwork Colossus. Sanctum of Ugin can only go find a Colossus if we have already casted one. Personally, I'm not that big of a fan of that type of strategy. While incidentally being able to tutor for multiple win cons seems overwhelming in certain situations, Sanctum is essentially a dead colorless land until we can cast a Colossus. However, that's a different story with Inventor's Fair. For 4 mana on demand, we can tutor up a Colossus or any other artifact that we may need without having to had cast this spell beforehand. This comes at a price though, seeing as how we need Metalcraft online to activate said ability. For any of those that don't understand what Metalcraft is, it's having 3 artifacts on the board at the same time. In addition, if we have 3 artifacts on the board, we start gaining 1 point of life each turn. While that won't necessarily be the reason of our opponent's demise, having another source of life gain in this deck is somewhat valuable. Seeing as how it's a legendary land though, I personally am not comfortable with running more than 1 copy in the main board. For our other non-basic lands, we have a 4 of Sunken Hollow and 2 Choked Estuary. These are pretty much playable versions of cards like Submerged Boneyard. While they won't always enter the battlefield tapped, you do run that risk, and it's why I cut it down to just 2 Estuary as opposed to a playset. For the rest of our lands, we have 7 swamps and 4 islands. Again, I want to make sure that we can cast our spells on curve, so that's why I wanted more than half of the lands in here to be non-basic. While this is a control shell, having a high amount of enters the battlefield tapped lands is an extreme hindrance in terms of being able to catch up to whatever it is that our opponents may be doing. Moving on to the sideboard, we take a look at the remaining cards that were in the main board, starting off with Fatal Push and Grasp of Darkness. We bring these cards in against more creature-based decks, like all the green-black aggro variants, green-white tokens, energy aggro decks, and any type of vehicle strategies. Next, we have a 3 of Negate. We usually want to bring this card in against more vehicle-heavy strategies, and mainly against any type of control decks that incorporate cards like Torrential Gearhulk or Dynavolt Tower. This also nails Planeswalkers, so if there's any deck that utilizes them, this is also a very relevant card to sideboard in. Moving on, we have a 3 of Transgress the Mind. This is also another card that we want to be bringing in against control strategies, as it can take care of their finishers, or it can help remove any type of interactive spells that can cause our deck to backfire on us. Not only that, but it can grab both halves of the Copycat combo, that being Saheeli Rai and Felidar Guardian. In addition, this also grabs other top-end finishers and other type of decks like Avacyn or Ishkana. We have a 1 of Disallow to bring in against any types of decks that both focus on tapping themselves out for an activated ability, or by casting 1 large threat like Ulamog. This spot is very flexible, as countering spells isn't too much of a concern in this deck, especially since this build is mostly sorcery speed. If your meta is much heavier with aggro creature strategies, I'd suggest playing another Yahenni's Expertise over this card. Our next card is a 2 of Ruinous Path. While we can make one of our lands a 4/4 beater with this card, we pretty much have a select few targets for this card, that being mostly Planeswalkers. There really isn't that many ways to deal with them in terms of playable spells, but this does get the job done most of the time. A deck like ours is very susceptible to combos like Copycat, so being able to interact with them is of the utmost importance. Our last 2 of is an interesting card that I'm currently testing out, and that would be Daring Demolition. So yeah, having a 4-mana creature kill spell is pretty mediocre, but the fact that this is a sorcery speed way of dealing with vehicles in black has definitely got my attention. The fact that this can deal with an Ether Sphere Harvester or Sky Sovereign can catch opponents off guard, as conventional removal spells don't hit those specific vehicles, unlike Grasp of Darkness or a regular Fatal Push would. And for the final card of our deck, we have a 1 of Baral's Expertise. So while it's not as splashy of a bounce spell like something like Crush of Tentacles, it has the benefit of being able to target specific threats, so that way we won't really have to worry about bouncing and recasting our artifact spells. Not only that, but it has the added ability that's somewhat similar to Yahenni's Expertise, where we can cast a spell with CMC 4 or less. This has the potential to be a huge tempo swing, as we can nullify our opponent's previous turn and slam down a threat that they may need to deal with, like Tezzeret's Touch, or any type of smaller artifact spells. And that's the deck tech for this week. What did you think? Is this something that looks interesting to you? And if so, is there any changes that you'd like to make to the deck? Let me know in the comment section down below. I know that this isn't strictly similar to other Metalwork Colossus decks, and I want to know what other kinds of ideas that you may have in innovating this super sweet archetype. If you enjoyed this video, throw a like my way and subscribe to the channel. I make weekly deck techs like this one and plenty of other magic related content for all of you to enjoy. Anyways, I'm Tasty Snackies, you all have been wonderful, and I'll catch you on the flip side.